Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to May 10, 2025 Coffee and Conversation. I went back and looked this morning, and we are more than 6 years of having done Coffee and Conversation. Interestingly enough, as best I can tell, the most frequent guest is Liz Ryer. She's been on 5 times. Angie Craig has been on, I think, three or four. Gary Hansen is with us this morning as one of our earliest visitors. This is the 87th episode. I didn't break it down into seasons, so we're into what, season 7, but I don't know what episode it would be. Privileged to have as our guest this morning, Ben Shierer. Ben has a lot of things on his resume, and one of which, of course, is his book on Rudy Perpich, Perpich, a Minnesota original, and we will talk about that at length. But before we do, Ben, I'm not sure how many people know you or know of you. So why don't you tell us about you? And I have some questions about your background and history as well. So screen's yours.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ron, and thanks everybody for having me. Um, my name's Ben Shierer, and I live in Fergus Falls, Minnesota. I'll just give a brief background, give you a little idea of who I am. So, 5 kids, got a couple kids at the University of Minnesota, have a senior in high school and a couple younger kids. My wife and I started 2 businesses in Main Street of Fergus Falls about 8 years ago. That's a strong connection to the community. And then also the other connection I have is I served as mayor of Fergus Falls for 8 years. I was elected in 2016 and reelected in 2020. I did not run for reelection as mayor in 2024. Previously, before that, I served 2 terms in the city council. So I was first elected to office in 2004, been really involved in local office, really interested, and I can talk about this a little bit more, but really interested as a rural progressive, as someone as an outstate rural DFLer, that divide that we all, I think, recognize, and that's been kind of the focus of my career, if you will, and one of the reasons why I wrote this book. So anyway, that's just a little bit about me, Ron, if that's enough, if that gives you an idea of who I am.
Well, it does, but of course, I've got some questions independent of that. I see wonderfully a number of names I don't recognize this morning. I believe this may be the first time that Mobilize put our event on their calendar. So welcome to folks who are joining Coffee and Conversation for the first time. This is really fun. We've been mostly focused on Senate District 52, which is Eagan Mendota Heights. I got the privilege to talk to Lauren, one of our participants this morning before we got started. Rules of the game, guys. Please feel free to ask questions. The best way to do it, of course, is to raise your electronic hand. I'd rather do it that way than have things in chat because it's hard for me to read the chat and continue a conversation. But this is as participatory as you want to make it, everybody. So please feel free to ask questions. Um, Ben, you were a city councilman and a mayor in Fergus Falls. Typically, those offices are nonpartisan. Is that true up there?
Yeah, yep. They're nonpartisan offices.
Okay. When you, oh, look at that. Somebody bought your book this morning. When you introduced yourself to Lisa Noah, when we first connected with you, you described yourself as a proud DFLer. How did you manage the politics of being what you just called a progressive DFLer in a community that may not be described as a hotbed of progressive Democrats?
Yeah, great question. And really good question. And I'll say this. So the night I was elected, I remember clearly the election night 2016 because we were running for mayor for the first time. And so I had the radio on listening to the local election results coming in and also, watching CNN and watching what was happening across the nation. And we remember what happened that night. And so there was this tension, right? Like, so, and I realized that in my community, we got over 60% of the vote, while so did Donald Trump. And so I realized that for me to be successful, for me to be in office, I had to be able to cross those lines and appeal to voters that typically would not would not vote for someone like me. And now I will say this: in 2016, I wasn't necessarily leading with my politics, but I also recognize in office, for me, it was incredibly important. If I was going to be able to accomplish things I wanted to get done, we needed a DFL administration in the governor's office in Minnesota. So in 2018, I came out strong in support of Governor Walz. I was the co-chair of his One Minnesota campaign, along with there was a few other people, but one of them was Mayor Jacob Fry. But anyway, I was very vocal. I was very proud to be a DFLer, and that did present some issues for me. And I think there's positives and negatives to that. You have to be able to build a relationship. So I would say that I think some people recognize that being mayor is about getting things done. It's about fixing streets. It's about economic development. It's about things that aren't typically thought of as partisan. Uh, but I won't lie. A lot of people didn't like the fact that I brought my partisanship. I guess I didn't shy away from my partisanship, but I think most people understood that for the mayor of your town to have a relationship with people in St. Paul is a positive thing. And I think the results speak for themselves. We were able to get a lot of things done in Fergus Falls that a lot of communities were not able to do, and that's because we were willing to build relationships with people in St. Paul. So I don't know if that answers your question. And ultimately, I ran for county commissioner in 2024, and I lost by a couple hundred votes. And that election clearly was a partisan. I mean, it's a nonpartisan office, but it clearly came down. Now you have to understand the net, we're talking 65-35 split Republican Democrat. Maybe some of the offices are even 70-30. So for me to get 49%, I mean, I think I'm proud of that. Ultimately, I did not win, and it was a partisan thing. So there's pros and cons to that, Ron, if that makes sense. But you have to balance it, and you have to. I mean, you have to be able to appeal to people across party lines, and I think that's kind of what I get at in this book a little bit.
Sure. And as I think I mentioned somewhere along the line, Gary Hansen is on with us this morning. Gary's a city councilman from Eagan, and of course, our office down here. It may be true statewide. I don't know that, but city council and mayor are nonpartisan offices
I
generally
think
in the state. That may not be true in the bigger cities, but in any event, it is true here in Eagan. And Gary's been a city councilman for a long enough time, and he has his own lessons and memories. But what would you tell Gary to do as the best secret and the best advice you've got as a nonpartisan city officer living in a red district?
Well, yeah, I guess again, like ultimately, you be open to listen and understand that the community you live in. I think if you can deliver results, people, that's the best way to break through, right? Like, and I got criticized from people on the right and the left, and I, really focused on delivering results, and I think it speaks for themselves. So I think that people, first of all, obviously, when you get to know someone, that breaks through a lot of barriers. Um, but also at the same time, I think right now in our politics, more so than ever, people want to know what you really stand for, right? Like they really want to know what at your core you stand for. And I think if they understand and you lead authentically, they're willing to look past. I truly believe people are willing to look past partisanship if they really understand and believe that you believe in what you believe in.
Gary, I saw you had turned your mute off. Did you have some comments?
No, just as I said in the chat, I've reached out to Ben in the past on behalf of Democratic municipal officials. It really is an issue in Minnesota, other than the largest cities. I think in the five largest cities, they do run for mayor and city council with party endorsements, but the rest of us don't. And so that's always an issue. Publicly, we have to be nonpartisan. Behind the scene, though, it's good to know who your friends are. And so there's a lot of support that our organization, DMO, can provide to Democratic DFL candidates for local office. And we're really putting an emphasis on that. That's and what our emphasis has changed over the last couple of years to try to get Democrats elected We know the Republicans did that starting under the administration and were quite successful doing it at different levels, local and county and in the court system. And look what it's gotten us today. So we're fighting the good fight and trying to do what we can to get Democrats elected locally.
Well, Ben, you talk about reaching out and being authentic and telling people, speaking to things that people want to hear about. What are those things? One of the biggest criticisms I see right now of the Democrats is that they're not messaging very effectively. They're not reaching people where their hearts and minds and pockets are. How do you do that?
Yeah, so a couple thoughts there. I can speak to my personal experience in Fergus Falls. So when I ran in 2016 for mayor, laid out a clear we just to set the stage a little bit. Fergus Falls, we have a historic downtown that, like many downtowns across the country and in Minnesota, has hollowed out. Right, we have we're on the interstate. You know, the big boxes had opened up on the interstate and hollowed out the downtown. We had this beautiful river that had run through our community, that does run through our community, and you could have come to Fergus Falls in 2016 and not even known that the river was there. So my focus was pretty clear. And then the other thing we had in Fergus at the time, we had this huge regional treatment center, which was internationally recognized for its architecture, but it was also 600,000 square feet of this historic property that sat on a hill, literally casting a shadow over my community that had paralyzed us for 10 years. We couldn't do anything on it. So anyway, my message was really clear, and that was we were going to focus on our downtown, our historic downtown, and our river that runs through. We're going to provide economic development by a progressive idea that local government can be a positive influence, create jobs, and we led with that. That was my message, and that was my main focus. It was around economic development and jobs based on the assets that we had in town, and then we put together a plan and we followed through and we were laser focused and we got it accomplished. And so now I can see out my window here, 8 years later, there's three properties along the river. So we did a major investment through the city. We purchased we had a couple lots that we made significant investments. There's a farmer market structure, a splash pad. We opened up the river, made those investments, which then leveraged some of which is right downtown, leveraged investments in the downtown. But as importantly, there's two properties. One of them is a historic mill that sat on the corner of the main intersection in our town overlooking the river and had been dilapidated and vacant since I was in grade school back in the 80s. And there's a $7 million investment in that property right now. It's going to open up here in later this year. And also just down the river from there is another vacant industrial site. It was a cheese plant that was not only dilapidated and vacant, it was contaminated. There was no private developer that would touch that with a 10-mile pole. And so as a government, we showed that the government can make a positive difference. We went in there, we cleaned it up, we made relationships with the MPCA, with the EPA, with DEED, with the DNR, every agency you can. We found different funding sources. We got the site clean, and now it's being redeveloped, or it's in the process of being redeveloped. So we showed that we didn't think the government was the answer, but government could be part of the solution to creating jobs and creating economic opportunities. And I think the downtown and local businesses have some. So anyway, not to go on too long about that. Sorry, Ron, but the point is that we were laser focused, and then once we had that trust, you're able to do other things, right? Like you're able to, like, we made more appointments of people that had historically not been involved in government than had ever happened before. So you're able to do some of the things that you want to do as a progressive, but you have to gain the trust of people through, I think, and for me, it's about, I think now if I take it up a level to the national or even the state level, it's about an economic message. The Democrats, the DFL, from my perspective, and again, this is kind of what I talk about in the book a little bit, and you have to lead with an economic message, gain the trust. When people understand that, then you're able to do some of those other issues. But I think the message from Democrats has become too diluted. It's become too scattered. And I think we're in a really important time right now. Like, I think as Democrats, like the fact that we're gathering on a Saturday via Zoom to, to talk about these things, Democrats are showing up. Just downtown, there's a demonstration in my hometown. People are showing up. I think the important thing is we have to be able to have disagreements within our party about what that message is going forward. That's critical to me. Everything I say today, I hope that not everyone on this call agrees with me. That's the important thing, that we as a party are able to talk through some of these issues and and disagree with one another, ultimately because we want the same things.
Well, but something didn't work in your county commissioner race. Your message
Yeah.
wasn't quite strong enough, shy a few hundred votes.
Yep.
Looking back, what would you have done differently on that race?
You know, um, That's a great question. I mean, I guess my rationalization answer would be, you know what? At some point, like I can't win it. I like it's okay. It's okay. I'm okay that I can't win here when it goes, when the Harris Trump vote is 65-35. You can convince so many people, but at some point, I can't compromise my values enough to get to,
Maybe you talk too much.
pardon?
Jill, Jill Hansen, I think you just jumped in on something. Did you want to make a comment?
No, I'm sorry.
I think
That's all right.
I think she said I talk too much. Maybe that's part of the problem.
Yeah, I know. I
I
don't think
didn't
she
rea-
was.
I'm sorry.
I don't think
It's
she was referring to you.
it's a confession.
Okay.
Okay.
I
Why don't
didn't
you hit
realize I was on audio. I'm sorry.
yeah, why don't you hit your mute button? And
Okay.
Ben, can I ask you a question?
yeah, go ahead.
How involved was the local government in helping Otter Tail shut down their coal plant and replacing it with a solar farm producing electricity? How involved was the local government in working with the utility company Otter Tail?
Yeah. We, ultimately that was a decision by Otter Tail Power, but I think that you know, we worked with them on the annexation of the land, on permitting, and it was a what I would say was a great partnership, and ultimately it ended up being the largest solar project within a municipal boundary in the city. But so we were partners with them. That was a decision that they ultimately made, but they came to the city right away and said, if we're going to do this, we need to work with the city. So there was definitely a partnership there.
Good, good. I was the guy that came to Otter Tail 30 years ago with the idea of putting the partnership with the University of Minnesota, that first wind turbine. That was I sold that to them.
Really?
And they were receptive. I went to like 15 different electrical companies and they were the only one that stepped up. So it's good to see them continuing their renewable energy pledge.
Well, and Ben, Lauren, who was just talking to you, is from Alexandria, and he's working hard to figure out how to get the DFL more present in his community and to win some elections. You've been through this. I don't know if you want to do it now, or maybe you guys should connect offline, but what advice would you have in trying to build the Democratic Party in presumably in a red community?
Yeah, is that to
That's to you,
Lauren?
Ben.
Oh, to me.
Ben, that's for you to talk to Lauren and give him advice.
Yeah, Alexander's got a lot of really positive things going, and I would just say, like, I was in Alexandria the other day listening to some of the
I
economic.
was there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah, and then the following Tuesday I was there again, Lauren. I'll actually out in Parker's Prairie at the Rock and Willow Ranch, but listening to some of the economic development projects happening in Alexandria, it's pretty impressive. So I mean, yeah, I don't. Again, I think I just think that it's a matter of like focusing on like getting progressive people in those positions focusing on the economic development of the community. But I'd be
Well,
open to to Gary and Lauren's perspectives too, like how they
let's
choose.
get to your book. I mean, the gravamen of our conversation this morning is to talk about Rudy Perpich. When Lauren, when you first reached out to Lisa, among other things, you wrote that Rudy is your political hero. There are many lessons that he teaches that would benefit our efforts today. Most importantly, and you said this already this morning, we can learn from his economic message that resonated with voters across the state. Whatever the issue, whether education, trade, or the environment, it's all tied to the commitment to jobs, jobs, jobs. You've already said some of that today. When I think about the Iron Range in northern Minnesota and the 7th and 8th congressional district, I think about the tension between the economy and the environment. So if the message is jobs, 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 and that's great, how do you balance the environmental issues in with that?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question, and I there's a in the book there's a kind of go into the late 70s and the Boundary Water Canoe area, some of the issues some people remember, and it's not like it's like this magical formula that everything then just goes away. But I do think that Rudy was able to build a relationship with people that could talk through those issues and balance them. And ultimately, I think it was 77 77 or 78 that there was a major Boundary Waters Canoe Area bill that came out. And I don't think it was perfect. I don't think everyone loved it, but it was a compromise that people were able to get behind, and it addressed some of the issues. I think it was authored by then Senator Wendell Anderson, and it was supported by Rudy at the state level. So I think that first of all, I think establishing those relationships. I mean, I know that sounds simple, but right now, I believe that oftentimes, if you go up into the 8th district, I think that they feel like people from the metropolitan area are coming up there telling them what to do with their things. And there's just a disconnect with the relationship. Like there's a basic fundamental relationship that does not exist now that existed then. That when you have those relationships, you can talk through issues that are complex and difficult.
Where did those relationships go? If they existed then and they don't exist now, what happened?
I think that, well, this is getting a little bit off. I mean, I like this conversation, and but it's getting, it's getting a little bit into political theories. Has anyone read the book, The Rural Voter, that came out in the last year or two? It's by a couple political scientists up in Colby College in Maine, Dan Shea and Nick Jacobs. But anyway, if anyone wants to get into that, like that idea of like what happened to rural communities and why are they, why is there such a divide? I mean, that book really is illuminating. And to tie it, I think, into the message that, my perspective is that, a lot of rural communities feel left behind starting in the 80s, right? Started probably around the time that Rudy Perpich came back and was elected. It started in the Reagan Revolution. Economies were changing. Rural communities were felt left behind. I think they resented the loss of jobs. They were angry about poverty and addiction that were happening in a lot of rural communities. It's not just in Minnesota, but this is across the country. And I think they were fearful about the future of their communities. And I think here's my take, and I'm open. I want to hear what other people think about this. At the heart, this is to me at the heart of the rural-urban divide. There is that resentment, that fear, and that anger that people truly feel, and they feel like the Republican Party has capitalized on that fear, anger, and resentment by pointing the finger at other people, has given people a reason to be angry, like to validate their feelings. And I think that the Democratic Party has either left the playing field, like completely vacated some of these rural communities and not even competing there, or I think people feel like they're offering a handout, right? And I think it goes back to, from my perspective, the focus on work. Rudy's focus on work was so core to who he was that he was that he was able to connect with some of these people, even though they had differences of opinions on a lot of issues. They had issues of guns and abortion, a lot of things that still divided people. but he led with that message, that economic message, and it was core. It was beyond just a job. It was for the sake of a job. It was what a job means and what the hope and optimism that having more than just providing for your family, it gives a sense of dignity, worth, and well-being for the future, not only yourself but of your community as well. So I think that like that core message, and for Rudy, I'll get back to the book. It was core to who he was. People remember the jobs, jobs, jobs slogan in the campaign, and in the time in 1982 when he came back, Minnesota was, if people remember it, I mean, there was a trifecta of agriculture, mining, and timber downturn, right? The national economy was on the way down, and he focused on that jobs, jobs, jobs. But it was also kind of core to who he was throughout his career. And he went back to in his childhood on the range in Carson Lake, which is a mining location just outside of Hibbing, Minnesota. When he was getting ready for school in the morning, when his dad's lunch pail was on the table, it meant his dad was working, and that meant a lot to his family, right? Like that was everything to his family. And when his dad's lunch pail was on the shelf, his dad wasn't working, and his family was going to feel the effects of that. And so that never left him. He had a progressive vision of government. The government could, provide a lot of things for other people, but it also, he understood the power of a job. And I think, generally speaking, we have lost the emphasis on jobs. Mark Dayton writes the foreword to this book, and he tells that story in there, and he tells how just fundamental that was to everything that Rudy did. And so today, I asked David earlier the speech, because the one speech have referenced, and I have that kind of illustrates that, Ron, is in '87. It was this Rudy State of the State speech, and he spoke for 30 minutes or whatever he spoke for. And those of us who've given speeches, you understand when you capitalize something in a speech, that's the emphasis, right? And there were four lines that Rudy capitalized in our 1987 State of the State speech, and they were these. They said, we're going to propose tax reform that rewards work, welfare reform that encourages work, research that creates work, and education reform that prepares for work. That was what it was focused on. And so I will say this, sorry, if I'm going on and on, but I'll say this, I'll wrap it up with this. It doesn't mean you don't focus, there's not social issues that you care about, but you're able to get to those social issues because, first of all, you're in office, and second of all, you have relationships that cut across some of these divides deep enough to address some of those social issues. Rudy was decades ahead of his time when it came to pay equity. He was working on that issue on the Hibbing School Board in the 1950s. Right? He appointed the first female to the state Supreme Court. In his first term. In his last term, he appointed Sandra Gardebring, who gave Minnesota the first majority Supreme Court in the state Supreme Court in the country. He also appointed more women and minorities than any governor before him. So he was able to do some of those social and progressive things, but he did it because he was in office and he had built relationships, and he had his core conviction that work was at the center of it.
So the current DFL chair, the new current DFL chair, Richard Carlbaum, I don't know if you've spent any time with him yet.
He's coming to Fergus Falls on May 20th. He's doing the listening tour. So I just talked to him yesterday, and he's going to be in Fergus. And I know him back to I know him back when he was, those who remember Chris Coleman, Chris Coleman ran for governor in 2018, Richard chaired that. So I've known Richard for a while, but.
Okay. His mantra for his leadership is listen, learn, and lead. You think that's a good one?
Sure. I do. And I think it's, I do. And I'm glad he's going to be out there. One of the things I talk about is, the listening part of it, like to get, I think we all want to get there. We want to get to where we have work across these divides, because that's the history of our state, right? But like I say, in order to get somewhere, you got to be willing to go there. And so listening, we have to show up. Like as a DFL, we have to truly show up in these communities and listen.
Yeah, the hard part, I mean, it's easy to go somewhere and listen, and it's easy to go somewhere and learn. The hard part is the lead part. How do you lead with what you've learned? And your message, my goodness, it is so clear this morning. Jobs, jobs, jobs. That's what Rudy talked about. That's what you're talking about, and everything else follows from that. So it sounds like the leadership has to be on the same economic issues that you described: education towards jobs, welfare towards getting people back to work. That seems to be the necessary mantra for Democrats, particularly in outstate Minnesota. Agree? Disagree? Modify?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's what's gone wrong. Like, I think that just like I said, like just that fundamental focus on jobs and the value of work. And that's simple. Like, well, people can say, well, there's more jobs than there ever have. Yeah, I get it. But I think the focus, if people know that authentically you care about the health of their community by providing jobs and valuing work too. Like, I think that that's really important.
So let's talk about what was the genesis of this book. Rudy was your political hero. I don't know from your background that there were any other books that you have authored. Why this one and why now?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And so he was not always my political hero. So real quick, 2017, it was October. Rita Albrecht was the mayor of Bemidji, Minnesota. She called me up and she said, I was new as being a mayor. And she called me up. She said, hey, there's Ben, will you come to Bemidji? There's some metropolitan mayors, and it was Jim Hovland from Edina and Jake Spano from St. Louis Park, and it was Molly Cummins from Hopkins. There was about six metro mayors were coming up to Bemidji. They wanted to talk about the rural urban divide and what we could do. So it was mayors, it was nonpartisan office, there was no policy aims, there was no partisan affiliation. It was just simply building relationships to see. And that at that meeting, something clicked in my mind, like that. First of all, I had the opportunity as mayor to talk about this and how important it was. And then I saw it as how important it was for us to get done what we wanted to get done in Fergus Falls. So that kind of became my focus. So I started doing, I love history. I started reading. One of my mentors was the president of the college. Now she's the president of West Central Initiative Foundation. I talked to her and she said, you need to read Lori Sturdivant. So I don't know how many on the call people know Lori Sturdivant, but she said, you need to read Lori Sturdivant, who I didn't know at the time. And she said, she's written a lot about the rural urban divide. So I started reading some of Lori's old
He's written a
columns.
lot about a lot of things.
Yeah. So I sent an email, a random email, cold email to Lori, said, hey, Lori, my name's Ben Shierer, blah, blah, blah. And she immediately responded back to me. She said, you're a mayor that I heard you speak at some such and such, and I really wanted to get to know you. So anyway, her and I started kind of a friendship and just talking about these things. And I pitched a proposal for a book on the last half of the 20th century about how Minnesota politics, because if you look at Minnesota history, right, like we've had progressives in both parties. We've been, Minnesota Miracle is a classic example of like, that was not one party dominating. That was like, you know, progressives and conservatives in the Republican Party, progressives and conservatives in the Democratic Party, working together across geographic and partisan divides to get something done that set us apart as a state. So that was really important to me. So I wanted to write a book about the last half. So I wrote my outline to Lori, and she said, hey, I think this is great, blah, blah, blah. She said, but there's one story you're missing in there, and that's the story of Rudy Perpich. And quite honestly, at the time, I didn't know the story of Rudy Perpich nearly like I should have. So I started on this road to learn a little bit about Rudy Perpich. And sorry for those of you who think I talk too much. I'm getting to my point. I'm kind of sensitive that now, to be completely honest. Like that comment got me.
I don't think that was referring to you, but that's all right.
It's I think it was, and it's totally fine. I just like so Ron. So I started down this, like, started reading about Rudy Perpich, and I remember being at the Minnesota Historical Society. And if you're going to go study Rudy Perpich, I'm an amateur historian. I love it, but I'm an amateur historian. And there's hundreds of boxes of documents in the base, in the archives of the Minnesota Historical Society and Rudy Perpich.
I have personal experience with that.
Like a needle in a haystack. That's right. Yes. It's coming back to me. You had the comment about Yale and Lori Sturdivant and Yale when the Pillsbury's.
Right.
I'd love to hear that. So the needle in the haystack I found that day at the Minnesota Historical Society was an oral history by Tom Berg. Some of you remember Tom Berg. He was a legislator in the 70s. He was actually Rudy's campaign manager. I didn't know at the time for his 86 campaign, and he wrote the book Minnesota's Miracle that was published by the Minnesota Historical press back in 2012. Anyway, I understood this oral history was really, really well done, and I grabbed a copy of it, and I started to put two and two together. I tracked down who had done the oral history. She was Barbara Somner she was in Lincoln, Nebraska at the time. Anyway, long story short, circuitous route up to the Discovery Center in Chisholm, Minnesota. There was 41 of these oral histories by people who knew Rudy the best. So it was his aunt and his childhood friend, and it was his commissioner of education, and it was Jim Obistar, and it was Mark Dayton and Paul Wellstone. It was all these people who knew Rudy from different perspectives in these really, really well done oral histories. Here's the kicker: all but 5 of them had never even left the archives of the Iron Range Research Center in Chisholm. So it was like this fresh amount of a bit of information on these really interesting and unique perspectives. So that was the basis for the book. It was telling these stories, what I consider the most colorful chapter in Minnesota's history, from a slightly different angle and bringing in these different perspectives. So that's maybe a long answer, but that's how I came to Rudy Perpich.
Did you do a lot of your own personal interviews, or was it mostly the historical research at places like the Chisholm Library, the Minnesota Historical Center?
I did some of my own. So I started out with, I did interview Tom Berg and Mark Dayton and Arnie Carlson, and I interviewed a lot of and Dave Dernberger, a lot of people that were just involved. I quickly learned, Ron, that as much as I love talking to these individuals, it was very beneficial and helpful. I'm not the great, like, that's a skill, right? Like doing a really good oral history interview, that's a skill. And so these 41 that existed, and they all took place in 1997, 96, 97, just after Rudy died. And there's 41, and they're really, really, really well done. And some of the people I could follow up with on some of it, like Roger Moe. You guys remember Roger Moe, of course.
Sure.
I know Roger, and Lori Sturvant was one of the people. So I could supplement that, but really, to tell you the truth, Ron, those 41 oral histories were really, really well done.
Okay. Well, those who fail to study history are doomed to repeat it. You've heard that line before. And as you have picked up, my focus this morning is moving the history into the present day, and what lessons did we learn from history that we can apply today. I want to focus for a second on a particular time frame in your Perpich book. And just to set as the background, Rudy's first term in office was December of 1976 to January of 1979. That was when he elevated from the lieutenant governorship to the governorship when Wendy Anderson went on to be the Senate. And then he lost the election in 78. His term ended in 79, went overseas to work, and then came back and was reelected and resumed office in 83. So he was not in office from 79 to 83, and then he continued in office until 91. So that's our time frame. I want to focus on that election of 1978 and what happened between Rudy leaving office in 79 till he resumed his political career in 83. And in particular, that election in 78 was called the Minnesota Massacre as opposed to the Minnesota Miracle. Why did that massacre happen? And what lessons can we learn from it to carry forward to today so that we don't have a massacre again from the Democratic perspective?
Yeah. Well, great question. And I really appreciate your understanding of history and like the research. Like this is great. So for I talk about it in the book, but I think that the chapter title for that is, I think it's The Hubris of Wendell Anderson and, the fall of the Democratic Party or whatever. But if you remember, like in 72, 74, like the Democrats had not had control, right? And 70, 72, 74, by 74, they had, I believe it was 70, they had total control, right?
Well,
And they were
remember that 72 Nixon won. And
Yep.
by summer of 73, we were heavy into Watergate. And in the summer of 74, Nixon resigned. So that's the time frame of that. Gerald Ford became president, and then Jimmy Carter won in 76.
Yep. And so in 70, Wendell Anderson was elected, and then I think they tied in the Senate, or ultimately the Republicans. Dick Palmer, there's a kind of a really interesting story about that in the book, where campaigned as an independent, then was going to caucus with the conservatives. But anyway, by 74, Democrats, and this is Roger Moe gives a really in the book, kind of tells his account of what happened. But a couple things happened. First of all, Democrats in total control, and they were doing things. They were high on their own power, right? Like they were getting things done that that had been bottled up for a long time, which is necessary. But then ultimately, I mean, I think everyone recognizes the one thing. If there's one thing that happened, that's when, of course, Carter chose Mondale to be his vice president. So in 76, so I think everyone remembers, but maybe they don't. So Wendell Anderson he was incredibly popular governor at the time, kind of couldn't go wrong. Decided that he was going to take the Senate seat. Now, had he appointed a caretaker and ran for the Senate in 78, I think most people would agree he would have won hands down. He didn't. He decided that he was going to step down as governor. Rudy was part of that, of course, because then Rudy would become, as Rudy was lieutenant governor at the time, he would become governor, and then he would appoint Wendell Anderson to the United States Senate. Super, super simple. The voters just didn't like that. Like that, they saw that as an overreach. And some of the other things that were happening, there was tax revolts going on. So there's a lot of things around it. But ultimately, if you have to pin it on one thing, it was that simple political miscalculation by Wendell Anderson to say, I'm going to, conceivably appoint myself, even though Rudy was part of it. So, if you remember, there was 2 Senate seats and the governors so Dave Durenberger, Rudy Boschwitz, and Al Quie won in 78, right? So it was that there was a reason that I think that I don't remember the numbers, but the Republicans picked up a huge amount of seats in the legislature as well. But because there was the Humphrey seat was up too, so that was the Boschwitz election, and then the Democrats had some infighting between some candidates. So anyway, but to answer your question, Ron, I think the number one thing was just the hubris of that decision by the political calculation by Wendell Anderson.
When was the Time magazine cover with Wendy Anderson? I remember it vividly. He was wearing fishing gear and
The Good Life in Minnesota, right?
Yeah, when was that?
I think it was set. So Minnesota Miracle legislation happened at the if we remember, in 71, in October of 71, through a special session. Totally a model for how government works across the state. I think that cover, boy, would have been 72, I believe. Maybe it was 73, but it was in the early 70s.
It was before Wendy decided to move to the Senate.
Yeah.
Okay. Arnie Carlson succeeded Governor Perpich. And I think you said you spoke to Governor Carlson as part of your book research. Is that right?
Yeah, I spoke to Governor Carlson prior to like the specific focus on this book. It was part of the broad, like where overarching, like, where we go with, or where we've been to where we can go. So yeah, so I did speak with them. It wasn't specifically about this, but obviously the last chapter in the book talks about that 1990 election, which those of you who lived through it and remember it, was probably the wildest election in Minnesota history. And Arnie Carlson obviously won that election.
Yeah. And Governor Carlson has been a guest on Coffee and Conversation with us in some time past, and it was quite an interesting and energetic, shall we say, conversation. He still is. Bless his heart, he's a very strong environmentalist. What'd you take away from him, even though your focus wasn't on Governor Perpich? What'd you take away from Governor Carlson about what he inherited, what he kept, what he changed? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so a fascinating conversation with Governor Carlson just about, he obviously, I mean, he sees a vision of the Republican Party in Minnesota, what it once was. That election of 1990, think about this for just a second. You had the DFL candidate, Rudy Perpich, was the pro-life candidate, and the Republican candidate, Arnie Carlson, was the pro-choice candidate, right? And Arnie, maybe he talked about it with you guys on the Coffee and Conversation, but he's very clear, like in 90 and 94, in 94, when he was running for re-election, the Republican convention turned their back to him. They literally turned their back as a form of like disrespect and protest. So he clearly, and then if you think about Minnesota Care, like Arnie Carlson was really instrumental in Minnesota Care, and he worked with Democrats in the legislature in order to get that accomplished. He realized the Republicans that he had weren't going to be on his team. And that's really ultimately kind of what like I see as like the beauty of Minnesota history and Minnesota politics. Al Quie worked with Roger Moe to kind of end that budget crisis of 81 and 82 in order and put his own political future aside in order to set the stage for ultimately what Rudy Perpich came into and was able to capitalize on and make good on. Arnie Carlson working with Democrats in the legislature on Minnesota Care. I mean, there's just a whole list in our state's history of working across those differences. So I just really enjoyed briefly meeting Arnie Carlson as part of that project.
Well, as we're reaching the end of Governor Perpich's tenure as governor, there was this speechwriter that he had. Let's get David Noah to weigh in here and talk about gosh, anything that's on his mind. David, tell us a little bit about what you did and what speeches you wrote and your memories of your best speech, the best speech that Governor Perpich rejected. Tell us some stories, David. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry. Well, it's a long time ago, and I didn't prep for this session, so my memories are hazy.
But you'll give us the strongest memories as a result.
Well, the strongest memory, of course, is that 90 election. It was horrible election. There were many moments where we felt completely hopeless because whether or not Grunseth was going to get kicked off the ticket or not, was out of our hands, and it just seemed unseemly to be out trying to campaign and raise money during that time, and it was very difficult, and it really felt out of our control.
Well,
so that was
remind people of the whole Grunseth issue. I'm not sure if everybody remembers that clearly.
Well, as Benjamin described, he got the endorsement. Carlson did not get the endorsement. He won the primary. He won the primary, and then he got accused of sexual inappropriate behavior in his swimming pool with his daughter's friends, and it went on and on and on, and finally, because of one of Governor Perpich's Supreme Court appointees, who he was disappointed in the ruling, they allowed the Republican Party to change the ballot to put Arnie Carlson on there instead of keep Grunseth on there. And correct me if I've got that wrong. Again, it's been a long time ago when that happened. So that was a very difficult time, and it was an election. I think people were ready for change. So Arnie won, and also that's the year Paul Wellstone won. So it was quite a change. So,
do you have any specific recollections of any of the speeches you wrote?
Well, my first big speech one of the first biggest, the speech I was most nervous about, the first speech I was most nervous about was the dedication of the Capitol Christmas tree. And the Wetterling family were there, and Jacob Wetterling had been abducted and was gone, and so they were there with him on the steps of the Capitol to dedicate the tree. So I felt a a lot of weight to make sure that that was a good speech. And he was his the power of his personality is hard to describe, and I think many very successful politicians share that. But he would, when something like that happened, and he would just call and say, "Dave, that was great, thank you," and just having that kind of a little brief chat with him made all the world and the difference. Then the speech I wrote he ran for the DFL endorsement. If you remember, 4 years earlier, he actually challenged the DFL endorsed candidate. He ran for endorsement. Mike Hatch was running against him. And that for him, he thought was a very big gamble. I wrote his speech, his acceptance speech at that convention, as well as some of the nominating speech, most of the nominating speeches, I think, that were given on his behalf. So, and then Betty Wilson afterwards said, "That was a good speech, Dave." And so that was nice as well. So there were he was a governor who was out in the community. So he would do capital for a day, go to different communities around the state. I think that was very unique at that time. And so he'd give lots of speeches. So I hated those days because it was a very busy time, a lot of speeches to write. So.
Thanks. Fun stories, David.
Mm-hmm.
Ben, I don't know if you have any comments on that. I've got 2 questions remaining for you, given that we're close to our hour. Any thoughts on the speech writing comments that David made?
No, I think he's spot on. Like, Rudy had a special connection with people, and it was being out, like, the 2 things David said, like, and it was about being out in the communities. I think there's a fascinating story. Like, people remember the power line controversy of the 70s, but for Rudy it was 77, 78, and he just left the Capitol, left his security, left his staff. Nobody knew where he was, and he just showed up at a farmhouse in near Lowry, Minnesota, to just talk to people at their kitchen table, which is wonderful. Now, there's also a side of that didn't kind of work too, and Perpich grew as he was governor. But anyway, yeah, it was a connection to the people. So I appreciate those stories, David. And the last capital for a day that I believe, was right here in Fergus Falls, and there's a little story about that in the book that I kind of came across, which is kind of fun. It was in October. It was during that campaign of 1990.
So let me roll my last 2 questions into one, Ben. We have some statewide office elections coming up in 26, a Senate seat and the 4 constitutional offices. We're going to confront the red-blue divide, the rural-urban divide, pretty big time with those statewide offices. In the context of Rudy Perpich's legacy, what should the Democrats be doing to win those offices?
Well, I think that, as you mentioned, Richard Carlbaum saying earlier, like, listen and learn, right? Listen, learn, lead. And I think that's important. Like, we've talked about for many years that, like, this is not a new thing, right? This has been happening for at least the last 4 decades. I will say this: Rudy Perpich was the last gubernatorial candidate to win Otter Tail County. And anyone who knows Otter Tail County, that in and of itself, that's kind of personal to me, right? Like, he was able to win. He did it with a simple message. It was a message on jobs, but it was rooted in the importance and power of work, right? I think that people in rural communities still feel that way. I think they recognize the divide, but we're all human. We all want the best for our state. So if the Democrats actually believe that and they want to show up and listen, and it doesn't mean just coming once, right? Like, you have to be there. You have to show people that you truly care. I think we can get back to, I'm not naive. I'm not saying that we're going to go all of a sudden flip these rural areas, but we can do a lot better than we've done. And we do it by showing up, listening, and having genuine conversations that are deep, meaningful, and that they continue. They're not one and done.
Any Democrats you want to endorse for any of the statewide races?
Well, I'm a loyal Democrat, so those constitutional officers, as far as I know, they're running for re-election, and I've supported them in the past, and I will in the future.
Okay, and the Senate?
I was up at an event with, there's three candidates right now. Ron. I was up at an event with Melissa Lopez Franson the other day. I've worked with her in the past. She and I and Steve Simon were the three New Deal leaders for the state of Minnesota for the last 2 years that she was in office, which is a nationwide group. So I know Melissa. I also obviously have a deep relationship with Lieutenant Governor Flanagan. I'm excited about that race because I think that as Democrats, we're going to be able to have really, really important conversations. So I'm not going to endorse anybody in that race, but I am endorsing the fact that there are really strong candidates that have different views on some of these issues. And like I said at the beginning, as Democrats, that's the most important thing for me going into 2026 is that we're willing to have those conversations within our party.
I was going to offer you the opportunity for closing thoughts, but I think you just gave them. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, I really appreciate the time, Ron. I appreciate the thoughtful questions and the time that you put into thinking about those questions. So thank
Yeah,
you. Thanks for listening.
I do tend to do that. Unfortunately, I spend a month between our conversations thinking about what am I going to do the next time. Oh my God. Anyway, let's wrap our conversation with Ben up. We can turn off the record, and Curtis, you always have the